Hello everyone, me again, just checking back in for our mental wealth reads video for today, whatever day you're watching this. We're going to go right back into Success Through Positive Mental Attitude, right into Chapter 7, which is titled Learn to See. When he was born, George W. Campbell was blind. Bilateral congenital cataracts, the doctor called it. George's father looked at the doctor, not wanting to believe. "Isn't there anything you can do? Wouldn't an operation help?" "No," said the doctor. "As of right now, we know of no way to treat this condition." George Campbell couldn't see, but the love of faith of his parents made his life rich. As a very young boy, he did not know that he was missing anything. And then, when George was 6 years old, something happened which he wasn't able to understand. One afternoon, he was playing with another youngster. The other boy, forgetting that George was blind, tossed a ball to him. "Look out! It'll hit you!" The ball did hit George, and nothing in his life was quite the same after that. George was not hurt, but he was greatly puzzled. Later, he asked his mother, "How could Bill know what was going to happen to me before I know it?" His mother sighed, for now the moment she dreaded had already arrived. Now it was necessary for her to tell her son for the first time, "You are blind." And here is how she did it. "Sit down, George," she said softly as she reached over and took one of his hands. "I may not be able to describe it to you, and you may not be able to understand, but let me try to explain it this way." And sympathetically, she took one of his little hands in hers and started counting the fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These fingers are similar to what is known as the 5 senses. She touched each finger between her thumb and index finger in sequence as she continued the explanation. "This little finger for hearing, this little finger for touch, this little finger for smell, this one for taste." And then she hesitated before continuing. "This little finger for sight." And each of the 5 senses, like each of the 5 fingers, sends messages to your brain. Then she closed the little finger which she had named sight and tied it so that it would stay next to the palm of George's hand. "George, you are different from other boys," she explained, "because you have the use of only 4 senses, like 4 fingers, 1 hearing, 2 touch, 3 smell, and 4 taste. But you don't have the use of your sense of sight. Now I want you to show you something. Stand up," she said gently. George stood up. His mother picked up his ball. "Now hold out your hand as if you were going to catch this," she said. George held out his hands, and in a moment he felt the hard ball hit his fingers. He closed them tightly around it and caught it. "Fine, fine," said his mother. "I never want you to forget what you have just done. You can catch a ball with 4 fingers instead of 5, George. You can also catch and hold a full and happy life with 4 senses instead of 5, if you get in there and keep trying." Now, George's mother had used a metaphor, and such a simple figure of speech is one of the quickest and most effective methods of communicating ideas between persons. George never forgot the symbol of 4 fingers instead of 5. It meant to him the symbol of hope. And whenever he became discouraged because of his handicap, he used the symbol as a self-motivator. It became a form of self-suggestion to him, for he would repeat, 4 fingers instead of 5, frequently. At times of need, it would flash from his subconscious to his conscious mind. And he found that his mother was right. He was able to catch a full life and hold it with the use of 4 senses, which he did have. But George Campbell's story doesn't end here. In the middle of his junior year at high school, the boy became ill, and it was necessary for him to go to the hospital. While George was convalescing, his father brought him information from which he learned that science had developed a cure for congenital cataracts. Of course, there was a chance of failure, but the chances for success far outweighed those for failure. George wanted so much to see that he was willing to risk failure in order to see. During the next 6 months, 4 delicate surgical operations were performed, 2 on each eye. For days, George lay in the darkened hospital with bandages over his eye. And finally, the day came for the bandages to be removed. Slowly, carefully, the doctor unwound the gauze from around George's head and over his eyes. There was only a blur of light. George Campbell was still technically blind. For one awful moment he lay thinking, and when he heard the doctor moving beside his bed, something was being placed over his eyes. "Now can you see?" came the doctor's question. George raised his head slightly from the pillow. The blur of light became color, the color of form, a figure. "George," a voice said. He recognized the voice. It was his mother's voice. The first time in 18 years of life, George Campbell was seeing his mother. There were tired eyes, the wrinkled 62-year-old face, and the knotted and gnarled hands. But to George, she was the most beautiful. To him, she was an angel. The years of toil and patience, the years of teaching and planning, the years of being his seeing eye, the love and affection, that was what George saw. To this day, he treasures his first visual picture, the sight of his mother. And as you will see, he learned an appreciation for his sense of sight from his first experience. "None of us can understand," he says, "the miracle of sight unless we have had to do without it." But George also learned something that is very helpful to anyone interested in the study of PMA. He will never forget the day he saw his mother standing before him in the hospital room, and did not know who she was or even what she was until he heard her speak. What we see, George points out, is always an interpretation of the mind. We have to train the mind to interpret what we see. This observation is backed up by science. Most of the process of seeing is not done by the eyes at all, says Dr. Samuel Renshaw, in describing the mental process of seeing. The eyes act as hands which reach out there and grab meaningless things and bring them into the brain. The brain then turns the things over to the memory. It is not until the brain interprets in terms of comparative action that we really see anything. Some of us go through life seeing very little of the power and glory around us. We do not properly filter the information that our eyes give us through the mental processes of the brain. As a result, we often behold things without really seeing them at all. We receive physical impressions without grasping their meaning to us. We do not, in other words, put PMA to work on the impressions that are sent to our brain. Is it time to have your mental visions checked? Not your physical vision. That is a matter for the medical specialists. But mental vision, like physical vision, can become distorted. When it does, you can grope in a haze of false concepts, bumping and hurting yourself and others unnecessarily. The most common physical weaknesses of the eye are two opposite extremes, nearsightedness and farsightedness. These are the major distortions of mental vision too. The person who is mentally nearsighted is apt to overlook objects and possibilities that are distant. He pays attention only to the problems immediately at hand and is blind to the opportunities that could be his by thinking and planning in terms of the future. You are nearsighted if you do not make plans, form objectives, and lay the foundation for the future. On the other hand, the mentally far-sighted person is apt to overlook possibilities that are right before him. He does not see the opportunities at hand. He sees only a dream world of the future, unrelated to the present. He wants to start at the top rather than move up step by step, and he does not recognize that the only job where you can start at the top is the job of digging a hole. So, in the process of learning to see, you will want to develop both your near sight and your far sight. The advantages to the man who knows how to see what is directly in front of him are enormous. For years, the people in the little town of Darby, Montana, used to look up what they called Crystal Mountain. The mountain was given this name because erosion had exposed a ledge of light, sparkly crystal that looked something like a rock salt. A packed trail was built directly across the outcropping as early as 1937, but it wasn't until the year 1951, 14 years later, that anyone bothered to stoop down, pick up a piece of the sparkling material, and really look at it. It was in this year, 1951, that two Darby men, Mr. A. E. Cumley and Mr. L. I. Thompson, saw a mineral collection displayed in the town. Thompson and Cumley became very excited. There in the mineral display were specimens of beryl, which, according to the attached card, was used in atomic energy research. Immediately, Thompson and Cumley staked claims on Crystal Mountain. Thompson sent a specimen of the ore to the Bureau of Mines office in Spokane, together with a request to send an examiner to see a very large deposit of mineral. Later that year, the Bureau of Mines sent a bulldozer up to the mountain and scraped off enough of the outer cropping to determine that here indeed was one of the world's greatest deposits of extremely valuable beryllium. Today, heavy earth-moving trucks struggle up the mountain and work their way back down again, weighted down with the extremely heavy ore, while at the bottom, virtually waiting with dollar bills in their hands, and are representatives of the United States Steel Company and the United States government, each anxious to buy the highly valued ore. All because one day 2 young men not only observed with their eyes, but took the trouble to see with their minds. Today, these men are well on their way to being multimillionaires. A mentally far-sighted person could not have done what Thomson and Cumley did, if his mental vision were distorted, that is. For he is the man who can see only far-off values, while the advantages that lie at his feet go unclaimed. Are there fortunes right at your doorstep? Look about you. As you go about your daily chores, are there small areas of irritation? Perhaps you can think of a way to overcome them, a way that will be helpful not only to yourself but to others. Many a man has made a fortune by meeting such homely needs. This was so of the man who invented the bobby pin and the one who devised the paperclip. It was so of the man who invented the zipper and the metal pants fastener. Look about you. Learn to see. You may find acres of diamonds in your own backyard. But mental nearsightedness can be just as much of a problem as mental farsightedness. The man with this problem sees only what is under his nose, while more distant possibilities go unclaimed. He is the man who does not understand the power of a plan. He does not understand the value of thinking time. He is so busy with the problems that immediately confront him that he does not free his mind to range into the distance, reaching for new opportunities, seeking trends, getting the big picture. Being able to see into the future is one of the most spectacular accomplishments of the human brain. Down in the heart of the Citrus Belt in Florida, there is a little town called Winter Haven. The surrounding country is farmland. Certainly it would be considered by most people as an area entirely unsuited for a large tourist attraction. It is so isolated. It has no beach, no mountains, only mile after mile of gently rolling hills with little lakes and cypress swamps down in the valleys. But to this region came a man who saw these cypress swamps with an eye that others had not used. His name was Richard Pope. Dick Pope bought one of these old cypress swamps, put a fence around it, and has turned down offers of at least $1 million for the world-famous Cypress Gardens. Of course, it really wasn't as simple as that. All along the line, Dick Pope had to see opportunities in his situation. For instance, there was the question of advertising. Pope knew that the only way he would be able to draw the public into such an isolated place was through a barrage of advertising. But ads cost money, so what Dick Pope did was quite simple. He went into the popular photography business. He set up a photo supply house at Cypress Gardens, sold his visitors film, and then taught them how to take spectacular shots of the garden. He hired skilled water skiers. He put them through intricate performances while over a loudspeaker he announced to the public exactly what camera settings they should use in order to catch the action. And then, of course, when these travelers went back home, the very best trip pictures were always of Cypress Gardens. They gave Dick Pope the very best kind of advertising there is. Word-of-mouth recommendations with pictures. This is the kind of creative seeing that we all need to develop. We need to learn how to look at our world with fresh eyes, seeing the opportunities that lie about us, but simultaneously looking into the future for chances that are there. Seeing is a learned skill, but like any skill, it must be exercised. We may think we recognize our own talents, yet in this respect, we may be blind. Let's illustrate with an example of a teacher who needed to have her mental vision checked. She was both nearsighted and farsighted, for she could not see either the present or the future potential abilities and capacities of her students, or their points of view. Now everyone, the great and the near great, have to have a starting point. They weren't born brilliant and successful. As a matter of fact, some of our greatest men were regarded as quite stupid at times during their life. It was not until they grasped a positive mental attitude and learned to comprehend their capabilities and envision definite goals that they started their climbs to success. But there was one young man in particular whom his teachers thought a stupid, muddle-headed blockhead. The youngster sat and drew pictures on his slate. He looked about and listened to everyone else. He asked impossible questions but refused to reveal what he knew, even under the threat of punishment. The children called him Dunce, and he generally stood at the foot of his class. This boy was Thomas Alva Edison. You will be inspired when you read the life story of Thomas A. Edison. He attended primary school for a total period of less than 3 months. The teacher and his schoolmates told him that he was stupid, yet he became an educated man after an incident in his life prompted him to turn his talisman from NMA to PMA. He developed into a gifted person. He became a great inventor. What was that incident? What happened to Edison that changed his whole attitude? He told his mother about hearing the teacher tell the inspector at school that he was addled and it wouldn't be worthwhile to keep him in school any longer. His mother marched off to school with him and told all within range of her voice that her son, Thomas Alva Edison, had more brains than the teacher or the inspector. Edison called his mother the most enthusiastic champion a boy ever had, and from that day forward he was a changed boy. He said, "She cast over me an influence which had lasted all my life. The good effects of her early training I could never lose. My mother was always kind, always sympathetic, and she never misunderstood or misjudged me." His mother's belief in him caused him to view himself in an entirely different light. They caused him to turn his talisman to PMA and take a positive mental attitude regarding studying and learning. This attitude taught Edison to view things with deeper mental insight that enabled him to comprehend and develop inventions which benefited mankind. Perhaps the teacher didn't see because the teacher wasn't genuinely interested in helping the boy. His mother was. You have a tendency to see what you want to see. To hear does not necessarily imply attention or application. To listen always does. Throughout success, through a positive mental attitude, we urge you to listen to the message. This means to see how you can relate and assimilate the principle into your own life. Perhaps you'd like to see how you can relate the principle of the following experience into your own life. Dr. Roy Pluckett, a DuPont chemist, made an experiment. He failed. When he opened the test tube after the experiment, he observed that it apparently contained nothing. He was curious. He asked himself why. He didn't throw the tube away, as others might have done under similar circumstances. Instead, he weighed the tube, and to his surprise, it weighed more than a tube of like make and design. So again, Dr. Pluckett asked himself, why? In searching for the answer to his questions, he discovered that marvelous transparent plastic, tetrafluoroethylene, commonly known as Teflon. During the Korean War, the United States government contracted for DuPont's entire output. When there is something you don't understand, ask yourself why. Look at it more closely. You may make a great discovery. Asking yourself or others questions about things that puzzle you may reward you richly. This very procedure led to one of the world's greatest scientific discoveries. A young Englishman, while vacationing on his grandmother's farm, was relaxing. He was lying on his back under an apple tree and engaging in thinking time. An apple fell to the ground. This young man was a student of higher mathematics. Why does the apple fall to the ground? He asked himself. Does the earth attract the apple? Does the apple attract the earth? Do each attract each other? What is the universal principle involved? Isaac Newton used his power to think, and he made a discovery. To see mentally is to think. He found the answers he was looking for. The earth and the apple attracted each other, and the law of attraction of mass to mass, applies to the entire universe. Newton discovered the law of gravitation because he was observant and sought the answers to what he observed. Another man, because he exercised his powers of observation and acted upon what he perceived, found happiness and great wealth. Newton asked himself questions. The other man sought expert advice. In Toba, Japan, in the year 1869, when he was just 11 years old, Kokichi Mikimoto continued his father's business as a village noodle maker. His father had developed an illness that prevented him from working. The youngster supported his 6 brothers, 3 sisters, and his parents. In addition to making the noodles daily, young Mikimoto had to sell them. He proved to be a good salesman. Mikimoto had previously been tutored by a samurai who taught, exemplification of true faith consists of acts of kindness and love for one's fellow men, not mere formal prayers uttered by rote. And with this basic PMA philosophy of positive action, Mikimoto became a doer. He developed the habit of converting ideas into reality. At the age of 20, he fell in love with the daughter of a samurai. The young man knew that his future father-in-law would not bless his daughter's marriage with a noodle maker. Therefore, he was motivated to harmonize with his known power. He changed his occupation and became a pearl merchant. And like many persons who achieve success in any part of the world, Mikimoto kept searching for specific knowledge that would help him in his new activity. He, like the great industrialists of our day, sought help from university. Professor Yoshikichi Mizukuri told Mikimoto of a theory of one of the laws of nature that had never been proved. The professor said, "A pearl is formed in an oyster when a foreign object, like a grain of sand, is stuck in the oyster. If the foreign object does not kill the oyster, nature covers the object with the same secretion that forms the mother of pearl in the lining of the oyster shell." Mikimoto was thrilled. He could hardly wait to get the answer to the question he asked himself. Can I raise pearls by deliberately planting a tiny foreign object in the oyster and letting nature take its course? He converted a theory into a positive action once he learned to see. Mikimoto had been taught to see by that university professor. And then he used the power of his imagination. He engaged in creative thinking. He used deductive reasoning. He decided that if all pearls were formed only when a foreign object entered the oyster, he could develop pearls by using nature's laws. He could plant foreign objects in the oysters and force them to produce pearls. He learned to observe and act, and he became a successful man. Now a study of Mikimoto's life indicates that he employed all the 17 success principles. For knowledge doesn't make you successful, but application of the knowledge will. Action. Many of the ideas which come to us as we learn to see with fresh eyes will strike others as bold. These ideas can either frighten us or, if we act on them, make us fortunes. Here is another true story of pearls. This time the hero is a young American, Joseph Goldstone. He sold jewelry to Iowa farmers door to door. Then one day, in the heart of the Depression, he learned that the Japanese were producing beautiful cultured pearls. Here was quality, and it could be sold at a fraction of the cost of natural pearls. Joe saw a great opportunity. In spite of the fact that it was a Depression year, he and his wife, Esther, converted all of their tangible assets into cash and set out for Tokyo. They landed in Japan with less than 1,000, but they had their plan and lots of PMA. They obtained an interview with Mr. Kei Kitamura, head of the Japanese Pearl Dealers Association. Joe was aiming high. He told Mr. Kitamura of his plan for merchandising Japanese cultured pearls in the United States, and asked Mr. Kitamura for an initial credit of 100,000 in pearls. This was a fantastic sum, especially in a period of depression. After several days, however, Mr. Kitamura agreed. The pearls sold well. The Goldstones were well on their way to becoming wealthy. A few years later, they decided they wanted to establish their own pearl farm, which they did with the help of Mr. Kitamura. Once again, they saw opportunity where others had seen nothing. Experience proved that the mortality rate of oysters into which a foreign object had been artificially inserted was over 50%. How can we eliminate this great loss? They asked themselves. After much study, the Goldstones began to use on the oysters the methods employed in hospital rooms. The outside shells were scraped and scrubbed to reduce the danger of infection to the oyster. The surgeon used a liquid anesthetic that relaxed the oyster. Then he slipped a tiny clam pellet into each oyster as a nucleus for the pearl that was to be formed. The incision was made with a sterilized scalpel. Then the oyster was put into a cage, and the cage was dropped back into the water. Every 4 months, cages were raised and the oysters were given a physical checkup. Through these techniques, 90% of the oysters lived and developed pearls, and the Goldstones went on to acquire a fabulous fortune. Time and time again, we see how men and women have become successful after they learn to apply mental perception. The ability to see is much more than the physical process of taking light rays through the retina of the eye. It is the skill of interpreting what you see and applying that interpretation to your life and the lives of others. It is the skill of interpreting what you see and applying that interpretation to your life and the lives of others. Learning to see will bring you opportunities that you never dreamed existed. However, there is more to success through PMA than learning mental perception. You must also learn to act on what you learn. Action is important because through action you get things done. Don't wait any longer. Read The Secret of Getting Things Done in the next chapter and move another rung up the ladder of success through PMA. Okay, so that was chapter 7. And I will say what I like about this chapter is the mention of mental farsightedness and nearsightedness, particularly being able to ask yourself why. And this is not just valuable in terms of success, right? Finding opportunities to build your wealth, things like that. It's also very, very important, very integral to the journey of counseling or therapy in the world of psychology, right? At some point, I hope they mention, Freud and all of the founding fathers of psychology, because they definitely utilized this method and made it the foundation of what we do as therapists. And more specifically, what came to my mind is the theory of cognitive behavioral therapy, right? It's the most common used form of therapy amongst therapists nationwide. And what makes it so popular and so useful is that it's both simple and complex, but it's monumental in a very, very, like I said, simple sort of way. And the idea of cognitive behavioral therapy is simply this: you have your thoughts, you have your behaviors, and you have your emotions, right? And they all influence each other. So the thoughts that you have, right, those are going to be influenced by, or those are going to influence the behaviors that you have. And the behaviors that you have are going to produce more thoughts or more or emotions themselves, right? So it would go, and it can go, it can be flipped a little bit, right? So thoughts create emotions, create behaviors. But generally speaking, it goes like this. So, for example, let's say your thought is that your friends don't love you, right? This is actually a relatively common thought for people who suffer with anxiety, right? The people in my life don't love me, or the people in my life don't care about me, right? So that thought is going to turn into probably an emotion first, but that's going to turn into a behavior, right? You're going to start behaving as if that's true. And so you go, my friends don't love me, and now you are isolating yourself, right? Because it's easier to just be alone than to be with people that you feel don't love you, right? Well, then that loneliness or that isolation turns into loneliness, right? A feeling, an emotion. And now you are feeling alone, right? And it's validating the thought you had before, right? And it's going to work in a circular motion, right? So like I just said, you feel your friends don't love you, you isolate yourself, and then you feel as though you are unloved because you are no longer with your friends, right? And then that brings you right on back to, well, my friends don't love me, so that's why I'm doing this thing, right? It could also be other things, and it's, similar to what's been mentioned even at the beginning of this book, where, the idea that I am from a poor family. I am not meant to be wealthy, or riches are not in the cards for me, right? So then you behave as if you're only, you can only earn so much, right? Let's say for whatever reason, I, was raised in a family that was relatively low income. So I only go for jobs that are within my comfort level, right? That are, maybe 30,000-40,000 a year, right? Or I only go after opportunities that keep me within that comfort zone, like I said. And then from that, I don't have money, right? And so that then reinforces that thought that I am not meant to make any more money than this in my life. And so, like I said, it's a very important sort of theory or practice or thing to be aware of, because this literally applies to every person alive. Whatever diagnosis you have or don't have, every single person follows, every single person's mentality in their life and their worldview follows this pattern, right? What you think influences what you do, which influences how you feel, which influences how you think, and so on. And of course, there are other theories that have a more complex view of this, of course, and you're welcome to look into those. It's not private knowledge to just therapists. You can Google counseling theories or counseling therapy styles and what they are. Or feel free to, message me, email me, ask me a question. I'd be happy to even just make a short video explaining those if you feel like you would benefit from that, or, others would benefit from that. I'd be happy to do that. But it's definitely, like I said, a very important factor of the human mentality. The next part is going back to that, mental nearsightedness, farsightedness, right? It's also another huge part of therapy to just ask why, right? And it's a question that if you do see a therapist, you are in therapy. If you pay enough attention to your therapist, you'll realize they ask this question dozens of times within a session, just in different ways, right? I myself, I'm sure I ask it, 10 times, if not more, just in different ways, right? Client comes to me and says, hey, there's, I'm feeling this sort of a way. I'm feeling sad lately. How come? Oh, well, I'm not sure, but, this has been happening to me and it's been making me feel this way. How come? Well, it's just because, when this happens, it makes me feel this way. Okay, tell me more about that. Explain that, right? So the whole process of therapy is literally asking the question why, right? And we ask that so we can tell you, so we can know what's happening, so we can help you. But also we ask that question to help train you to start asking that within yourself as well. And lots of people already have that ability, right? Lots of people are already asking that question, which is why they are now in therapy, because they've asked that question to the furthest of their knowledge, and they found a stopping point, right? They don't know. And so now they need someone who's trained in mental health, in psychology to help fill in the blanks, right? But then there are certainly some people who, it takes a little bit of practice, right? Maybe you weren't raised in an environment that gave you answers, right? Or maybe you weren't raised in an environment that supported the idea that there were answers for things like this, right? And that's, I think, a lot where disorders tend to develop too, where you're feeling depressed, but you're in an environment where it's not really being acknowledged or it's not really being addressed, and so there's this sort of level of acceptance, right, where you just accept that this is how things are. Another word for that, and another really interesting concept to research, is the idea of learned helplessness, right? The idea that, or the concept that this hardship that I'm feeling, or this thing that I'm going through, this is just how it is. I cannot change it. I have no control over it. It's just how it is, right? And there are different experiments done, probably back in the 70s. That's what it is. Psychology did a lot of their experiments back then. But there was one in particular that was done on dogs who were put in cages. And again, this is years and years and years ago, before society started saying, hey, let's not do this to animals. But they had these dogs in cages, and there was a sort of a system in which the dog could ask in a certain way, by, I think it was either tapping something or pushing some sort of a button or something, to indicate they wanted to leave the cage, right? And sometimes, the experiment was on how regular the reward was, right? How regularly a dog was allowed out of the cage when he pushed the button, right? And some of them happened. They let the dogs come out every single time, right? And then other dogs, they did more of a ratio, right? Every third time, they could come out. And then another group of dogs, I think, was like almost never, right? There was no regular pattern to it. And what they found was the dogs that were consistently rewarded, those dogs had seemed to have just a higher morale, right? They were more positive. They were found to be more active. They were, showing signs of a happy dog, right? The ones in the middle that had a sort of ratio, they a little less happy, but still relatively upbeat, still like, okay, like, I don't understand this, but it's whatever, because I do eventually get what I want. The dogs that had no regular pattern, those were the ones that had a lack of hope, right? Those were the ones that were always had the appearance of being sad, weren't very active, slept a lot. Like, you could just tell that these ones were different. And that is where the concept of learned helplessness came from, right? They assigned it to these dogs who had just learned that they were helpless. They could not do or control their situation, right? And so bringing that back to this conversation about mental nearsightedness and farsightedness, it really does depend on what your brain has been trained to think about opportunity, what your brain has been trained to think about the control you have over your life, hope versus despair, suffering versus reward, or prosperity, right? Those things all factor in to the opportunities you take and the opportunities that you pass up, and what you think about opportunities in general. Do you think you even have any, right? And the truth is, you will always have opportunities, right? Not just in success, but mental health wise too, right? There is always an opportunity to ask, why is this happening to me? And then to take action, like the book says, and say, okay, like, based on what I know, I feel sad in this situation, but not in this situation. Okay, why? What is happening there? What's different there? Okay, well, though I'm not sad when I'm around this certain person, right? Okay, what are you getting from your relationship from that person that is different from other people who aren't making you feel happy, right? And then just continuing on in that questioning, and then using what you know to create a better situation for yourself, right? And I think that's incredibly important. And also, another shameless plug, that is what we try to do as therapists as well. We try to help retrain your brain to think about those little setbacks, those questions, those what is this happening and why does this exist, moments as opportunities to change your life, right? The goal of a therapist is to ultimately become obsolete, right? We are not meant to be with you for the rest of your life. If that happens, it's cool. Some people just like to have that check-in. But the point of being a therapist is to do such a good job, training you, the client, to think and figure these things out for yourself, that you don't need to keep paying us to do that, and that's really what we want. That's really the goal, is to, help you, get into or be a member of society that is actively and pro-socially improving it, or thriving in it, at the very least. So there's all that. I do gotta let you guys go. I've got a client coming, but thanks again for watching. Hopefully I'll start seeing some questions in the comments. But until then, take care, and I will see you next time.